Vamos a dar inicio a la segunda sesión plenaria de esta mañana, el futuro de la economía colaborativa y sus implicaciones en el sector de servicios. Para ello invitamos al escenario al señor Luis Ross, Special Advisor for Innovation Digital Economy Initiative, Office of the Presidency Inter-American Development Bank, quien será el moderador de esta sesión, y a los señores Sean Sullivan, Public Policy Lead for Central America and Caribbean de Airbnb, y el señor Ivo Correa, Policy Director for Central America and Caribbean de Uber Technologies. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. We'll have this panel in English, but I think that we're going to make it in a way that is going to be very interesting for all of you. What a perfect segue to the presentation that Diego just did in terms of the digital economy and how that is being transformed. But I think that one thing that it really stands out when we look at the digital economy is the peer-to-peer business enabled by the digital platforms, right? What we call sharing economy. And in a way, if you think about the sharing economy and the impact it's already having in the region, it's tremendous, right? It's creating new competitiveness, it's promoting growth, but yet it's creating some issues when we think about the regulatory framework and how does that operate? What are some of the issues for the market operators that are currently functioning, the incumbents? And what does it mean for them to have a new set of competitors? And so today, I think we're going to be able to have these discussions and to understand a bit. So I would like to frame the conversation of sharing economy on upstream implications and downstream implications. For the upstream implications, what I'm saying is that if you have to discuss the appropriate regulatory framework, which means policy, it means infrastructure and connectivity. I mean, you have to think about connectivity because otherwise only the urban areas that are connected are going to take full advantage of the sharing economy. But we have also to think about the rural areas. So connectivity is a key element when you're thinking about taking full advantage of the sharing economy, right? Competitiveness, I have mentioned this before. This is a key element when we begin to expand the sharing economy beyond mobility and beyond the host industry. And the last but not least, and we have heard this in the first panel about artificial intelligence and virtual reality, the impact on employment, the impact on the labor market. So this is what I consider upstream issues that we have to take on and discuss when you're thinking about promoting the sharing economy and take full advantage and actually bringing the full potential of the sharing economy for Latin America. The second set of issues that I think are important for us to discuss today are the downstream part of this conversation, which is, how do we plug millions of people into this industry? I mean, take the example of Uber, Airbnb. There's millions of players today functioning into that industry. And the question is, how far downstream does the sharing economy impact people's lives, right? And for the audience that we have today, one critical conversation we have talked about briefly is that how do you engage the software industry, the local entrepreneurs in the region to take full advantage of that growth? So what I wanted to do is to have this conversation between upstream and downstream. And I will start then asking our speakers and panelists, what a great panel. Take advantage of having Uber and Airbnb, which are two of the most emblematic companies today in the sharing economy. So this is really a privilege to have you two here. So let me start with this. I mean, when you look at in the upstream part of the conversation, in the engagements that you have had with governments to talk about regulatory framework, what are some of the things that issues that you face constantly? And more important, have you learned in this process of entering Latin America? Some of you are in 15, 20 countries in the region already. So are there lessons learned in that process that you'd like to share with us? Please, either Ivo or Sean. Do you guys have mic? Okay, please.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking you for the invitation, thank you for the IIDP. Luis, let me start by give you a little context on how Uber operates in Latin America, and then I would like to point out two different topics regarding the upstream discussion you mentioned. So first of all, Latin America is a very special region for us at Uber. Currently is our second largest region in the world, just after the US and Canada. We have been operating in 15 countries across the region, but we expect I actually expect in the next 2 months for Latin America to surpass the US and become the largest region in number of trips for Uber in the world. What makes me think about that is that right now, São Paulo is our largest city in the world in numbers of trips. Mexico City is our second largest one, and Rio de Janeiro is becoming in 1 week or two the third one in the world. So it's a very, very large market, basically as a result of very, very complicated mega cities across the region. So we have like mega cities in Mexico, here in Central America, and South America, and Brazil, and of course a bunch of very important mobility challenges in some of the cities, right? So I think Uber has been helping the cities to rediscover and think again about their mobility in terms of how we can improve this for many citizens across the region. Given that scenario, let me point out a little bit what are probably the most two challenge topics in the upstream framework that Luis described. I think the first one is that basically when we arrive to a city, when we arrive to a country, in our case, we are most of the time dealing with very outdated regulations, right? We are basically dealing with regulations that were produced 3-4 decades ago, and that of course couldn't have foreseen what was to come, couldn't have foreseen what impact technology would have over cities, over mobility, right? So basically, when we get to the cities, when we get to the countries, the regulations in general don't have any kind of framework specifically to the kind of transportation, the individual transportation that Uber is connecting right now, the riders and drivers we are connecting across the region. And then we start a very interesting discussion on how does Uber operate under this regulation, and how does a looking forward regulation, how does a modern regulation taking into account technology should look like, right? That's the kind of discussion we have been seeing and have been having across the region. I would say that in the beginning there was a lot of doubts and a lot of questions around that. I think more and more what we see is that some of the governments, some of the regulators are taking advantage of this discussion and actually reviewing the whole transportation regulation, the whole mobility regulation. So it's not anymore about Uber or about a different app like Cabify, 99, other transportation mobility apps. It's about how do we think about mobility, how do you think about transportation regulation in the modern world, taking into account what technology provides, what technology can produce in terms of mobility, right? So I think that's the first thing I have been seeing a lot, and I think what some of the regulators have been doing is actually deregulating things, is actually saying, oh, some of the things that made sense 40 years ago, 50 years ago, are not the case anymore. So if you look to safety, for instance, do you guys feel safer, you know, by a bunch of rules that say, oh, the driver and the vehicle should be registered in the municipality, in the government's kind of thing? Or do you feel safer that you know the name of your driver, you know the picture of the driver that's gonna pick you, you know exactly the time he's coming or she's coming, you know what's the itinerary, the path that you're gonna follow, and you can share your ETA, you can share your location to everyone in your contacts in your phone. So that's the kind of, so maybe the regulation shouldn't be so worried about this kind of things, and technology can solve some of the problems that regulation used to do back there 40 years ago. So this is the first kind of upstream trend that we have been seeing. The second one, which is pretty well related, is that the first round of discussions we have in many of the cities and many of the countries is still are framed in something like Uber versus taxis, which I think is completely wrong, is a very poor way to look at that. If you look at Uber as a taxi company, first of all, I mean, you didn't get what Uber is doing at all. I think the first thing I would highlight here is that we are not a transportation company. We are not a mobility company. We don't have one single car besides the 3 or 4 we're testing self-driving cars in the US right now. But what we do is that we connect a lot of people. We connect drivers and riders so they can move around the city, right? So we are basically a technology company. What we're doing is providing technology that can connect people and make them mobility, make their transportation easier in different cities. Besides that, what I think it's really important is that my real competitor, I think the real competitor for Uber is not a taxi, is not transportation companies, but it's actually private cars. What we're discussing now is that, does it make sense to own your car for your life? I mean, does it make sense for a couple to have 2 cars in their garage, for instance? Does it make sense for you guys to have a car for the whole time? I don't know if you guys know that, but the average around the world is that cars, they sit idle for 95% of the time globally. So you guys are using your cars for 5% of the time, but 95% of the time they are sitting idle. They're just parked there doing nothing, right? Occupying some space. So this is the kind of discussion we're gonna have. I think when you look a little bit broader and you look like, what's the future of mobility? What's the future of our cities? That's the discussion we want to provide. So for our ride, it's very interesting because I think there are a bunch of studies around the world, and I think the most important one is a study by the American Public Transportation Association, APTA, that says that, first of all, people who use ride-sharing apps like Uber, like Lyft, like Cabify, other ones, they are more prone to use public transportation as well. And once people realize they have a reliable and affordable alternative in terms of ride-sharing, and they can combine ride-sharing and public transportation in a very efficient way, they have a huge tendency to just let their car go and look for alternatives. So start not using their own private cars, but using, as I said, public transportation and ride-sharing. And then that's the kind of discussion we're going to have. So how would our cities look like if instead of a bunch and millions and millions of private cars, we could have a small amount of private cars being used for a lot of people, so more people in fewer cars combined with public transportation? What kind of transformation this would produce in our cities? When you look to that, I think the discussion is completely different. Right now in the US, 10% of the millennials who are Uber riders, who use Uber, they say they prefer not to have a car because they have alternatives that they can use and are actually cheaper and better for their lives. So I think that's the kind of, when you look to this problem from that perspective, then you start discussing things like we have in different cities across the region where instead of investing in a new park building, a city decided to finance part of the Uber riders for some of the citizens in a way that took cars out of the downtown and make it cheaper for them to move around the city. You start discussing integrations like we have in different cities with the transportation, the public transportation authorities, in which the government is actually subsidizing Uber rides for people so they can integrate public transportation. So they take of course the subway, they take the bus, but then for the last mile or the first mile they take a ride sharing option, and then for the government it's cheaper, and actually the impact over the roads, the impact over pollution, over the environment is much less. So the kind of discussion we're going to have is not Uber versus taxis or Uber versus other kind of transportation, but what's the future of our mobility? What's the future of our cities? How can we use ride sharing? How can we share our resources in a way that can produce, improvements for cities and citizens across the region? That'd be my first comments.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Sean?
So let me give you a little background on Airbnb. I mean, I'm sure many of you know us. We are in approximately 192 countries, 65,000 cities, and we've had more than 180 million people use our service over the past 8 years. When you think about it, it's pretty amazing. And I think similar to Uber, what we allow people to do through our technological platform is basically allow people to unlock existing assets, and I think that's the key. One of the things that I think we wanted to discuss on this panel, and Ivo touched on it as well, is what are some of the challenges that we face as sharing economy companies when we go into new markets, and specifically in Latin America, which is a growing and important market for Airbnb. It's not our largest, but it is going to get there soon, I think. For us, there are a number of challenges we face as companies that all companies face. I mean, on the regulatory front, when we deal with governments, just like Uber, we're dealing with Airbnb, we're dealing with, for example, a hotel and tourism piece of legislation that was drafted in the 1950s, 40, 50 years before the internet was even established. We talked a little bit about, what are the challenges we face or how we enter new markets, and I will use Costa Rica as an example. And I was very happy to hear both the Vice President and the Minister's comments earlier this morning, because I do think if Costa Rica is really dedicated to embracing the sharing economy, the digital economy, whatever we want to call it, then I think Costa Rica will have a leg up on many of its neighbors in the region. But I'll just give you some background on kind of how we are trying to enter the market here. And if there's anyone from the government here or any press reporters here, I will reiterate Airbnb's commitment and interest in reaching a deal with the government of Costa Rica. And that's something that I'll be talking about later today with the media. But one of the challenges that we face here, regulatory-wise, in part deals with data privacy. Who are our hosts? And that basically boils down to the government wanting us to turn over personal data, identifying data about our hosts. Now, as a digital company, as a technology company, we have a number of restrictions. As an American company, we have a number of restrictions on how we can actually do that. But one of the things that we've offered the government here, and this is what I do throughout the region, is to collect and remit taxes on behalf of our hosts, because we feel that our hosts should be paying their fair share. Talking to them about issues related to regulations, because one of the major, kind of opponents or critics of our company is the hotel industry. But also we want to share aggregate data with the government. So these are all issues that we put on the table. It's issues that we put on the table with governments. And in general in the region, we get positive comments and positive, reactions from some governments and less so from others. But I think one of the keys, that I think governments really need to understand is that this technology, this new way, this new economy is not going away. This is consumer driven. If you, the people, didn't want this, Uber and Airbnb would not exist. We are merely technological platforms connecting person A with person B. And we really think that it's important for governments, and I think both of our companies are willing to work with them to help them to embrace the sharing economy. Because in many respects, Airbnb and Uber, we are the poster children for the sharing economy, but the focus should not be on us. If I was a Costa Rican politician, my focus would be on how can I create an enabling environment to allow future Costa Rican entrepreneurs to prosper and to develop this country. And by focusing maybe too much on the negative of perceived shortcomings of Airbnb and Uber, the government loses sight. So for me, it's important for the government to embrace the sharing economy and do what they can do to stimulate their own economy. And I'll just end with this really quickly, but right now in Costa Rica, for example, we have 7,200 hosts, 12,000 listings, accommodations, and your average host here earns about $2,800 per year. Now, we think that's a number that can grow a lot, and we think it's a pretty good, decent added income for many families in Costa Rica. So again, we think government should embrace the sharing economy. This is what people want, and you can't fight the future.
Thank you, Sean. And I'd just like to share an anecdote or a number that fascinates me regarding Airbnb in Rio de Janeiro. I mean, fourth largest city for Airbnb, 33,000 properties in Rio. But the interesting here is that during the Summer Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, 85,000 travelers stayed on house, let's say, that within Airbnb and generated income or revenues, if you want, of $30 million, right? So it's quite impressive that, this kind of thing. And it leads us to the conversation of the downstream conversation, which is, these platforms are able to plug in millions of citizens or peer-to-peer business, as we call, be it a rider, a driver, be it a host, and you can go for the different sectors, this is growing. And this is a tremendous impact. But the one question that we always relate to, when, particularly in talking to governments, what is the value creation for society, for local society? And I think Sean mentioned something that for me is very interesting, is that in this value chain, how do you plug in other players? I mean, not only the writers, not only the hosts, but the ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, how the software entrepreneurs, the local software entrepreneurs and other players participate. Because I think that would be interesting for this audience to hear about. So, Ivo?
Well, let me start by saying that I think the economic opportunities we are creating, both Airbnb, Uber, and the other companies around sharing economy, it's impressive across Latin America. If you look at Costa Rica, we have now more than 500,000 chicos using Uber every day to move around, and have more than 10,000 people in Costa Rica driving for Uber, using Uber as an economic opportunity, using Uber as a source of income. The interesting part here is that I think there are places in which we offer a very important alternative for people who have been looking for jobs for a long time. So if you take our first, we started our Latin America operations in Mexico, and if you take the first months in Mexico, 50% of our drivers were unemployed for more than a year there. So it's a huge number. But more than that, for me, more important than that is I think the most interesting characteristic quality of the economic opportunity that Airbnb, Uber, and other companies offer is the flexibility. Mm-hmm. And I think the flexibility attracts exactly a lot of people exactly the people who have more problem to find a traditional, regular 9 to 6, 9 to 5 job in the formal traditional market. So if you look to our platform, more than a half of the drivers across the region, they drive less than 10 hours per week. So actually they are using Uber as an additional source of income. They're using Uber as an alternative to complement their income, their household income, and they're actually, most of the time, there are people who traditionally wouldn't have the time to be in a 9 to 5 kind of job. So people who are like women who are taking care of their children, of their family, and then take some of the time off to drive. There are senior citizens. There are young students who are actually taking classes in the morning or in the afternoon and driving the other period. So this is the kind of opportunity. A lot of people with disability. We have a very important program with deafs across the region. So there are a lot of opportunities for people who are actually most of the time excluded from the formal employer market. On your second question, Luis, I think there are many opportunities for the software industry. I think, for instance, right now Uber is actually opening their first open platform on data. So we're gonna share all our data from specific cities. The larger one, we're starting in Latin America with São Paulo, Bogotá, and Mexico City. And from that, you can plug in a lot of different things that we could use this data to produce in terms of mobility applications and discussion around transportation. So there are a lot of things. Of course, all in the same way. Basically what we are doing is using a technology that everyone has in their pocket to help moving around. So the more Uber grows here, more people will demand in terms of technology, in terms of connectivity, in terms of infrastructure. And finally, what I think is really important is the point that Sean highlighted before. I think more than discussing, when we're discussing regulation, more than discussing regulation for Uber or for Airbnb, we're discussing that what's a modern regulatory framework that can actually stimulate innovation, that can stimulate the countries in Latin America to produce new technologies, to produce new apps, to produce new products. And I think that's the kind of discussion that interests us. It's not about, as Sean said, it's not about Uber, it's not about Airbnb. Sometimes these companies, because they are large international companies, they can even support this discussion and wait for 1 year, 2 years to actually have a modern regulation. But the guys who are on the ground, the people who are right now trying to innovate in Costa Rica, in Mexico, in Argentina, these people, they can't wait so much, and they need a modern regulation. They need their governments to stimulate innovation in their countries. That's the most important thing from my perspective.
Yeah, I think, you know, on the labor issue, I think a lot more work needs to be done on the impact that the sharing economy is having on labor markets. Obviously, it is substantial. I think from the Airbnb perspective, we also view it as an opportunity for people to earn extra income. And I'm sure, like Uber, we have thousands upon thousands of stories of people around the world who have used Airbnb to help pay their bills, pay their rent, take care of a loved one who's sick, etc. You know, one of the best statistics that I'm able to use when I meet with governments and other stakeholders is the fact that 97 cents of every dollar stays with the host. Our transaction cost is 3% on the host side. And basically what that means is that hosts are making and keeping the money for themselves, and on average, hosts are spending 40% of that money that they're earning literally within a 10-block radius of where they're living. So that's having a direct impact on their local communities. And for us, that's a great statistic. And again, I think like Ivo is saying, I think the important thing to understand is the fact that, you know, the conversation shouldn't always be about Airbnb or Uber. It should always be about, you know, how can governments stimulate local entrepreneurs? Because for us, I think, for people that work for these companies, that's what brought us to those companies in the first place.
Great. Both of you have referred to your companies as technology companies, right? And it's true, even though, as I say, from a branding point of view, you know, you're really much associated either with, you know, driving or urban mobility and then hosting. But as technology companies, and as you grow fast, what are the other opportunities that you're seeing to participate into this, to participate in other markets? I mean, what other sectors eventually are you looking at? In terms of, you know, thinking about, you know, the muscles that you have built, the intelligence that you've built, the data, the connectivity and everything that you have. I mean, as a technology company, can we imagine to see Uber and Airbnb in different sectors operating in the short time?
For Airbnb's part, yes. You know, Airbnb was founded in 2008 by three gentlemen who are still in their mid-30s, which blows my mind. But they had a great idea at the right moment, and they executed. And their focus was to build a company that would last. And they did that by creating a company culture that is one that everyone still abides by and everybody kind of lives by. And, you know, their vision for the company is that we're basically just beginning. We launched a new product last November called Trips, which is basically very kind of detail-oriented, very unique travel guide experiences. But they're looking at this, you know, not in terms of quarters or years, but decades. And I think that, you know, in 10 years, Airbnb is going to look dramatically different from what it looks like now.
Thank you. You.
Well, I would agree with Sean here. I think the first of all, it doesn't. I know that it looks very intuitive and very easy, the way, you know, all of us use Uber on our everyday. But the truth is that there is a lot of technology and a lot of intelligence behind that, a lot of product development behind that. So we keep trying to improve the product more and more. There's a large team. Most of you, and I should have asked in the beginning, but most of the people I meet, they have used Uber as a rider, but a reduced number of people has used as a driver. If you go to the driver app, it's a completely different experience, and there is a lot of technology there behind that to help the drivers to, you know, find the best opportunities across the city. But more and more, what I think that from our perspective, there are a bunch of things we are looking at. So, for instance, we have a big, and there was a discussion before, we have a big artificial intelligence lab right now at Uber. But I would say that the two most important things we are looking at right now, first is how do we use the network we created between riders and drivers for other purposes, and how we make it more efficient for them. So for instance, in some countries, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico, we already launched our service of food delivery, which is a variation of what we do, and we're exploring other opportunities like that. I think the second thing, and that's probably the most important things in terms of future of mobility, and that's not Uber saying, but Uber, Google, Tesla, General Motors, Ford, everyone who's interested in mobility, it's about probably self-driving cars, the autonomous cars. I think that's something we're just starting, but the impact that this technology could have in our cities and in our lives is impressive. Just take this number with you. I mean, we lose in the world 1 million lives per year in traffic accidents in the road. So if we could have a technology that can save at least 1 million lives beyond, people get harmed and all the cost for the health system, I mean, I think there's a huge impact there. And the other number I think it's really important is that the first OECD estimative is that if all of us shared self-driving cars that could be used as efficient as possible, the fleet of cars in the world would be reduced by at least 9%. So imagine in your cities that instead of having 100 cars, you have 10 of the cars you have. For each 100 cars, you have like 10 or less. So the impacts are huge, and I think there's a long path in that direction, but this is something we have been exploring a lot and using all the technology and intelligence we have in the company right now.
Thank you. Listen, to finish this, I'd like to ask both of our panelists today. We have probably 600 entrepreneurs here from the region, mostly from the region. And they probably are looking at Airbnb and Uber and saying, wow, I mean, what if we could have figured out a way to have companies that could grow and function across the region and even be globally? What would be some of the advice that you would eventually give them and to help them think about, what are some of the key elements of success in running a company like Airbnb or Uber? But more important, I mean, what do you see in the market, in the region, as you function, as you operate, that would give them a leg up in terms of, thinking about, how to develop a business using some of the digital platforms and the platforms that we have today? Sorry to put you guys on the spot, but this is just thinking about the audience and what could be valuable for them as well.
I think this would be a longer conversation. I don't know if I have a great answer, but to be honest, I would say two things. First of all, I would actually repeat some of the panelists of one of the previous panels that don't be afraid. I mean, move forward, get a step forward. I think if you wait for regulations, legislation to tell us what we can do, what we cannot, innovation doesn't come that way. Innovation comes from sometimes very simple idea, but great ideas that can help people's lives. And if you look at Uber, I mean, the idea is pretty simple, and the technology is not. Now it's a lot of technology, but at the beginning it was very simple and actually helped a lot of people's lives, and that's why it grew so fast. And I think the second part is that, I mean, I would look for things that could change the day-to-day lives of the people in the region. I wouldn't go for like big shots, but how, and our region is amazing because we have, millions of people and we have a lot of important problems in our cities, in our countries. So I think technology can still help solve some of these problems, and I think from that we can innovate a lot.
Super.
Yeah, I would say follow your passion, know your markets, seek advice, talk to people. Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, infamously out of the blue somehow managed to get a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg to get just basic advice on how to get Airbnb up and running. So I would look for people like that can also help and guide. And again, I think, do what you know and find solutions to problems that people haven't yet. And like Ivo says, there are a lot of important issues that the region's dealing with now that technology could do a lot to, if not resolve, definitely help.
Listen, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your thoughts, and some of the things that are yet to come in terms of the sharing economy. I would like to give a round of applause to our panelists for this incredible session. Thank you very much, all of you.
Muchas gracias por esta participación a los señores Luis Ross, Sean Sullivan e Ivo Correa. Muy amables por acompañarnos este día.